Okay, thank you for coming back. So Anthony is prepared. He has his bottle of beer up there and his Guinness or whatever it is, porter in his hand. It's evening, so we're a little more relaxed, but we are attentive. Yeah, actually, to sort of start the more informal part of the evening, the first meeting I had with Assemble was not the press release that they had been given this major award in 2015, but actually it was 6 months before, because my youth, I spent living in a place called Lloyd Road, which is 200 meters from the Standard, which is on Black Horse Road, and across Black Horse Road was your workshop. And when I went home one weekend, I don't often go home, as I call it, but my mother is still there. She's 91, and she's an artist. And she still explores the city, and goes to diverse events, and writes to prime ministers and tells them they don't know what they're doing. Then she said, I must take you to a nice place, a workshop for artists, which I found. And I think I'm a bit old to join them, but perhaps you could do something about that. So the reason why you're here, actually, is because you're going to get the proposal from a 91-year-old, incredibly active artist who wants to join Assemble. And she happens to be my mother. And unless you do that, your fee will not be will not be sent. I think. Because I feel I have to acknowledge her status of an artist. And she's always said, you never believed I was an artist, would you? But anyway, she took me around, and we did actually go around your workshop and see what you're doing. So that was my first meeting with Assemble. But that's just to give a very light-hearted, but anyway, thing about how connections in the cities do turn up. So thanks very much for coming. And the other reason we kind of invited you was not just to talk, because we kind of thought that you might be able to come at some point and be active in Copenhagen at some point with the project Metropolis. So this is also depending on what you say. So you can see there's quite a lot. So this is a kind of interview, you know. So, but disregard all that. We're happy you're really happy you come, and thanks for that. And we're really looking forward to being inspired by what you've been doing. Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, as long as your mother has no ambitions for income generation, then it might be a goer. So I'm Anthony, one of the UK collective Assemble. I'm going to start by a kind of slight argument about what I think. How I think we make space for kind of cultural production in cities, and why that's important, and then in a kind of more light way kind of illustrate that by going through the history of our workspace, and then kind of peppering that with some other projects worked on the way, but really how we've kind of found ourselves in the city, and how we've found the ability to make ourselves in the city, and ultimately how that's led us to believe that's really important to be able to share. That ultimately that's like the most important thing, is the ability to kind of shape, reshape, and shape the city around yourself. So I'd like to start with a quote. Despite all its rhetoric of novelty and innovation, neoliberal capitalism has gradually but systematically deprived artists of the resources necessary to produce the new. And so that's from Mark Fisher, who's a kind of cultural theorist based, and he recently died, unfortunately, who writes a lot about how increasingly like culture is self-referential, and how that actually, because the more that kind of capital takes on culture, the harder it is to do anything new, because the more the imperative of making it something that's valuable very quickly kind of takes over. And so in the context of that, I'd like to talk about and kind of evangelize for is the provision of and preservation of affordable workspace in the city for creative production. And the problem's very clear. So in London, the GLA has recently highlighted that about 30% of affordable workspace will be lost by 2019. And this pattern is not unique to London. This is something that exists in kind of growing cities across the world. And so let's compare two models of affordable workspace provision. So the first is Black Horse, which is the reference that Trevor just made. And here the deal is you pay £250 for one of those desks. For that's included access to the workshop. That's all in. You can do whatever you want with it. You can store stuff in it. And it's this kind of amazing, rough, adaptable, personal workspace. If we compare that to another model, which is WeWork, who also refer themselves as affordable and creative, the cheapest I could find, which is the one in London Fields, is £300 minimum, though it quickly rises if you go to any other centre. But that's X service charge, X tax, and anything else is charged for. And it's not I'm saying these spaces are bad, it's just that this is what's happening increasingly in cities. This is the provision you get. When you talk about creative workspace, it's WeWork coming in, and they have, if you look how aggressive their expansion is, they are taking over this sector. And I think that that's a real problem, that when creativity becomes sitting in essentially a cafe with a laptop, you're really undervaluing what a huge section of kind of creative production is, and equally, it becomes entirely synonymous with a kind of entrepreneurial attitude, which I think is fundamentally wrong. And then just how easy it is to then co-opt this language of creative to ends that are completely antithetical to the cultures being co-opted. So Box Park, in their own words, which is wherever Box Park lands, it aims to be part of a community that is by adding colour, creativity, and a life of its own. And looking at the brands, I don't know if you can see the images there. Not many of them strike you as kind of small, down-to-earth, local kind of brands. And then that in turn becomes the marketing ploy for a new development. So this is an advert. This is a real advert for a development called Hackney Square, where Box Park becomes the alternative that you're turning your back on when you turn your back on the norm. Which actually is this. It's a private development of market housing by a company called Telford Homes, who are a PLC whose end goal ultimately is shareholder value. And so here we see how the idea of creativity has fundamentally been co-opted and ultimately corrupted and probably destroyed in the interests of making more money. So coming back to Mark Fisher again, if there's one factor above all else that contributes to cultural conservatism, it is the vast inflation in the cost of rent and mortgages. And so from here on in, I'm going to kind of go back to our story and how we found ourselves and how we found a way of getting round that. As one model, I'm not saying it's the only model, I'm not saying that we've fixed it, we definitely haven't. It's all compromised in all sorts of different ways. But I guess the argument I'm trying to make and the kind of case I'm trying to make is that we need to think outside the models that current economics and current capitalism prescribes for development of spaces. And that's not something that kind of cultural policy purely can fix, but that cultural policy has an important part to play. And ultimately, so that's my case. Without these spaces of production, the culture ultimately will falter and fester, and our cities become less vibrant and less exciting. And that culture is more than applied activities to spaces. It has to be accessible, embedded, and produced in the cities for it to be live. So to start with our kind of creation myth. So the Cineroleum was our first project, and really that's how we started. We started as this is 2010. A group of mainly architecture graduates who had come out of a kind of hopeful education to kind of design staircase details and toilet fitting, and a situation where I realised I was making the world worse with this kind of horrific block of flats I was sort of working on. And really a desire to kind of come together and build something. At this point we had no idea that we had any agency, had any kind of, there was no real I guess the politics was embedded in it, it wasn't explicit. But really the task was looking for us, and this is from a context of kind of quite extreme privilege really. We were all university educated, in a kind of top UK university that really gave you the confidence to go and do that, but use that to try and test our agency out in the city. We identified the petrol station as a model. So in the UK at the time, about 600 were closing every year, so there are only about 4,000 left. And this is against the context also, this is 2010, so the crash had just kind of hit, developments are stalling, and so really we were quite lucky in the sense of timing that meant there was kind of sites that were abandoned or were empty, and we were lucky enough to find a developer who was willing to let us use this particular site on Clerkenwell Road, which is quite an extraordinary building actually, as long as we took all the liability on, which is kind of fine. We didn't have anything to lose. With nothing to, if we sued us, we wouldn't get anything. And so each member in the group invested £50 in the project. We secured £2,000 from an arts grant. So this is not vast sums of money we're talking about here. I think often the assumption is that somehow you can only do things if you've already got lots of capital. I mean, £50 if you really I think most people could afford £50 with a bit of thought if they really believed in something. and that was the kind of investment. And so we didn't have much money, but we had a different economy. We had people and friends and lots of hands. And so the whole project became around how you could use this amazing resource. So this is a project since then we've been quite strict. Either everyone's paid or no one's paid. So if it's a volunteer, it's completely volunteer. We don't get any money from it. We're not. I think that dynamic of some people being paid while other people volunteering is deeply problematic. So we're quite clear on that. Like these were free, but there were everyone involved. That was the deal. We didn't get anything out of it. So repurposing kind of cheap and utilitarian materials, because that's all we could access, to kind of make these special elements. So scaffold boards became the chairs. Old shelves in the back of the petrol station became the sign. Donated Formica became the marquetry. We even built a vacuum forming machine to kind of try and recreate the kind of tiles to slightly toxic effect. And then the Tyvek roofing material, which were again donated, became this kind of festoon curtain. And we really looked back towards the kind of picture palaces of old and looked how we could try and go back to that grandeur of the cinema-going experience. That similarly, we felt that a lot of us really love cinema and felt that it's sort of been watered down a bit. And in order to enable that, basically come up with, I mean, that probably hasn't really reproduced very well. I'll go forwards, you don't look at that too much. But basically, tried to come up with a system that was about systems of production that were very low-level, replicatable, and easy to come in, understand, and then adapt. So someone who was a volunteer could come in and within a day could improve and change it and really felt that they had a kind of capacity within the project. And then on top of that, we designed the costumes, we programmed the film, we staffed the bar, and that's an idea that a building and a space is beyond its design. It's also how it's programmed, how it's inhabited, how it's owned. All those things are integral in how a project functions. It's not, the smell of a popcorn is as important in a cinema as the way it looks. Without that smell, it's like you're not in a cinema, you're somewhere else. So here it is. I'm just going to run through some photos of it. And then at the end of the film, the project itself became the performance. And it needed 12 people to hoist the curtain up in this kind of role reversal where the audience suddenly became the observer. And someone described it like having your trousers pulled down. We're kind of sitting there in silence suddenly. And by the end, the project got quite, I mean, this is unexpectedly, the project got quite well known. There was an audience of about 40 people outside. So about half of the audience inside were outside watching, waiting for this thing to open. So it's quite dramatic. And so we really emerged as a practice through this, I guess through this exploration of how we explored our agency within the city. And that really kind of cemented our belief that fundamentally it was about trying to share that with other people. And actually that the thing that excites us and interests us and then really our passion is how you can enable people to express their agency within the city or within the place they live. It doesn't have to be a city, to be fair. And so we were on the hunt for a home. And again, the Olympics plus the financial crisis equaled a lot of empty buildings on the fringe of the Olympic sites. It also equaled a lot of Olympic money kind of flying about. And the LLDC, who were, at the time they were the OLDC, which is the Olympic Legacy Development Corporation, offered us this site, which is in this kind of industrial wasteland next to Bow Roundabout. A kind of building that couldn't really lease out. It has no value. It was too leaky. It was full of asbestos and X, Y, Z. That used to hold a sign maker that went bankrupt when they lost the contract for Wetherspoon pubs, which probably is more kind of, I don't know, means more if you're in London, if you're in England and you're used to spoons being around every corner. And it came up with this very basic idea, which you had the studio in the back, which is this kind of background of production, and then a kind of public offering in the front. And then kind of set about trying to create that in a very kind of improvised way. So one is our first sign, then eventually we got the kind of sign on the right, that's the kind of evolution. Kind of create it as a brand. So I'm marketing it as a kind of space in its own right. We set the building up with a pizzeria, so one of our pizzas, and kind of used it as a test bed for ideas about how we might run events. So we have kind of community events. This is the Newham Young Mayor. We had kind of events with local schools. We had raves. I mean, we generally think like nightlife is a really important, I mean, it's kind of a facile thing to say, but I think that's a key part of it actually. It's not just about like design, and it's also like alternative cultures in all their guises. We'd staff the bar like we did at the Cinerarium and the Folly, had some very boring architecture events, all behind this kind of very unassuming kind of entrance of a door literally hacked in the side of an industrial building, with a kind of workshop in the back and this kind of event-like space in the front that over time worked out really wasn't working very well. I think we kind of, I mean, we were young, we were naive, and we assumed that somehow there'd be a public to come to this industrial wasteland, and after the Olympics that wasn't really the case. And it was absolutely freezing cold. And so the people who come to parties, the parties are great, but ultimately we didn't want to be kind of events organisers, and the way we liked going to parties, putting them on wasn't necessarily the best thing. And so after a few too many raves and some late nights and early mornings, we started having to think and realised really this wasn't a model that was particularly effective. And kind of simultaneous to this, we'd started work on Black Horse workshops. This is one of my segues. And Black Horse Workshop was an idea that following the riots in London in 2011, there was a package of funding called the Out London Fund that was designed to help ameliorate the social situations that contributed to the riots rather than cause, I think. And we started working with the Walthamstow Council, who had this industrial building that the tenant had just left. And we were really interested in like this kind of, I guess, this emerging idea of the space of affordable production being the kind of thing that was really missing in London at the time and really under pressure. And we had to prove demands. We constructed this strange mobile workshop, carted around running workshops. But then, crucially, we actually produced a kind of very dry, very clear business plan. I think that's the bit that's often left out of kind of architectural talks, is that it's not just kind of nice drawings and swanning around in coffee shops drinking flat whites. A lot of it is like this stuff. You create the organisation, we did the business plan, we did the marketing plan, and we had to learn how to talk the language of the developers to be able to kind of have any hope of justifying our case. And so we won the funding. And the end result is this place that is a kind of amazing place for both working and learning. It currently has a membership of about 2,000. It's got about 100 businesses based there directly, and that from everyone in the spectrum, from individual kind of real businesses through to kind of hobbyists who just kind of rock up and play around with building a stool. And it's proven a real success. Again, like slightly unexpectedly, the lease has now been extended. It celebrated its 4th birthday last year now, not this year, and has recently kind of extended and refined its offering. So we have more kind of rough assembly spaces, both outside and inside. It's improved the workshop facilities, has some private studios, and really is about like creating this space that is intentionally a bit messy and intentionally a bit rough, but that through those things like architecturally not necessarily that beautiful even, but it has enough of attention invested in it that it really supports people and makes space at a rate that's affordable for people to kind of engage with it. And one of the best things about the project is we met these two of them, Workshop East, who are an incredibly skilled collective carpenters from the British Craft College who are just up the road in Stratford. And they needed a space, and they had hit a similar problem to us, which is they couldn't afford anything remotely close to what they needed in London at anything remotely what they could afford. And so the kind of learning from our previous failure of running a cafe and the kind of evolution of Black Horse, so we've jumped back in time a bit now, to be fair. Black Horse sort of opened after it's happened, but the kind of research of Black Horse is what kind of led to this as it was kind of contemporary. Became much more about kind of workspace and production, and then specifically though about workspace that was about making things. And also, I guess, if Black Horse we thought of as kind of this open access, quite loose, quite easy to, like, very low barrier to entry, this was aimed at a kind of step above that. So when you want your own space, but you can't really afford a whole workshop yourself. And working with Workshop East, who bought the machinery, so they exist as a collective to buy the machinery. They got a loan from that. We gave them discounted rent. They then rent out the machinery to other people as well, other tenants, who pay for the upkeep of the machinery. And so this kind of creates this kind of slightly strange symbiotic relationship between the different tenants that allows you to invest in a bunch of different kind of collective resources that individually you wouldn't be able to afford. So we invested more in the metal workshop. We got a kiln. I think that's actually me. We moved our office into the kind of studio that had been used as raves. We kind of re-kitted the front of house into be something that's much more about kind of making. And so this kind of collective of people that kind of assembled in the building enabled us to fund this kind of quite luxurious amount of space that had a real range of specialities from metalwork, woodwork, ceramics, finally had a decent office that we could work in seriously. And in doing so also enabled us to kind of take our work a lot more seriously. And so this is the model for Goldsmith. So this is another segue. This one's slightly less smooth. A model for the Goldsmith College of Art was a competition we won in 2014, kind of slightly surprising. But the reason why I'm talking about it is in this sense, this luxury of space allowed us to work in a way that normally would be very, very difficult for architects or designers, in that we could really kind of tackle and prototype and ultimately build kind of whole chunks of the building. So this was a mock-up, this is a one-to-one mock-up of the facade that we have now built and delivered entirely. So that entire element is something that we built in-house, developed in-house. I don't have a photo of it on yet because the building's under construction, but like kind of this is the rendering of it, sort of early tests, and some couple pictures of that building on site. So it felt like it was a really, this way of a more like networked, more like low, like kind of lo-fi in some ways, provision of workspace enabled us to work in a way that could get us out of the kind of paradigm of just specifying stuff, but actually getting really hands in, which is a personal thing for us. And again, this is something that it is really personal in some ways, that we could really get into the manufacture of the components, working closely with others to deliver them. And so that model proved quite successful. And so we were looking, I guess, in some ways to expand and we had a very limited amount of space. We also had this ongoing reference of the Amish barn raising as this kind of like amazing collaborative, collective act, and had this empty site as an opportunity. So coming back to this image, the thing I didn't really talk about was this building, which was currently an empty site. And so here we proposed trying to build the most generous sized, affordable spaces as possible. And then coming back, again, this is another case where you have to kind of really take on the mantle of developer. So kind of do the program, submitted a business model to the LLDC, and through this kind of level of work that we both through kind of having Black Horse, having the workshop space running, we proved that this was an economically viable alternative to the kind of hegemony of kind of workspace provision that was happening at the time with people like hot desking on laptops, and that this could make money. And this, so like, yeah, kind of understating this, I don't think making money is bad. It's like understanding how by doing it you kind of share the benefits of that embetterment as widely as possible, rather than kind of concentrating it more and more and fewer people. So it's not like I'm not one of these kind of Marxist capitalism, capital, money bad. We're still a business, but I think it's thinking about how the process of doing that can make more people, can be shared more widely, and can enable better things rather than one or more concentration. And then this kind of a process of kind of again really building it hands-on, so we had to kind of innovate to keep costs down. We couldn't afford solid bits of timber, so we worked with an engineer to come up with screw lam, affordable glue lam. We kind of self-fabricated connections. We learned how to drive a crane and scissor lift, and this kind of strange frame came together. We were finally able to do the barn raising photo, and this kind of strange urban object emerged on the skyline, and that working very closely with the people already we were working with. So the carpenters, for example, built the staircase. An artist, this should start playing, an artist called Molly worked with us to make 1,200 coloured concrete tiles. And again, this is one of those things that it was a very easy replicatable process, although she might not say that now after having made 1,200 of them. And that was really about kind of creating this kind of decorative edge, so that the building that was the cheapest building possible, at the same time was an urban building, and was, you know, a bit, I mean, in a very, very kind of pretentious way. It was a bit like those Baroque churches that, you know, when you see stripped of their, you know, they're actually really just simple sheds, but they've got a decorated facade. So we're kind of angling for that. But the inside, so this is inside before people moved in. And the idea that we just supplied the bay, and because this was targeting mainly, I guess, mainly kind of people who are making things. The idea they could fit the space out themselves. Some put mezzanines in, some put like storage in, but ultimately what they got was space and light and height, and those are things that are incredibly difficult to find. But then the yard became this kind of backdrop, so it became this social and productive space, and the space that you could have parties, you could have other things, that you could have a culture around it. You know, like I said, we're really into parties. Everyone likes it. But I think it was really important. I think it's one of the things that people know the space because they came for parties, and because the parties weren't marketing. They weren't like marketing opportunities for us. I think that's the thing, that a lot of companies do parties, but they were just raves. They're like 750 people would come down to the yard and have a party, and people would sort of know we're loosely, but most people just came and had no idea who Assemble even were, which is, I think, great. And it became unexpectedly like its own icon. We won the award. It's now appearing on phone. They made a fake one in China. This is in a shopping centre in China. This is a fake one they've printed, without our permission, by the way, in China. But what was more important is that I guess it really allowed the space to develop a critical mass that before the studio was quite limited, and it essentially had another sort of 12 units, each with 2 or 3 people, of people who really created a critical mass that meant it became a kind of creative network in its own right, and developed a kind of, yeah, like I said, a momentum. But unfortunately, we had to leave. Like all these things, the reality is that was a temporary space that we only had because it was going to be redeveloped. And in their credit, the developer in that was incredibly fair, very supportive, and I don't have any like ill feeling towards that developer. They really supported us, but that was the game. And so we had to start peddling ourselves. So we kind of sent around this document to landowners. Kind of selling ourselves as, and this is where I'm always slightly uncomfortable with this, but again, it's kind of like the name of the game. You have to kind of compromise to get anything done. Essentially, selling ourselves as sort of like good PR if you let us kind of run our studio from your house. And found this building, which is a kind of fairly anonymous building. It's currently owned by Grosvenor, who are the Duke of Westminster, one of the largest private landowners in the world. And again, sold them this idea of turning this empty space, it was a former school, into kind of a vibrant, kind of creative, you know, all those buzzwords space. So this is kind of pictures before. Pictures of me moved in and kind of got turfed out with all our stuff. And end up having to, because we ended up being sort of kicked out before we were ready, we ended up having to camp in like the office upstairs, which turned into like the sort of site office, which was a bit of a dark days, I think, really, being stuck in there. That's Louis, one of our colleagues who but really, again, had a similar strategy of kind of turning these kind of big empty spaces into quite robust, quite adaptable spaces, a better kind of workshop. So really making a space purpose for this mill of equipment that the kind of workshop piece. The workshop piece came with us, and here it is, kind of now. Kind of reformulated front of house an idea that's one that's much more about storage and production and making, and this space that enabled to make, but then also building on like new possibilities within that space. So one of the rooms upstairs, one of the pictures upstairs I showed you, was a bunch of old recording studios that were the school's old recording studios, and so now we have I think it's 6 studios. And like really great people up there, so people, yeah, kind of working there, and it means that the kind of building has this amazing kind of diurnal range where people, you know, all the carpenters get in at like 7 AM and start working, and then leave at 4 or 5. We get in like 9, 9:30, 10, leave at sort of 6, 7, 8, depending on what's going on, and all the musicians get in at like 6 PM and leave at like 2 AM, and it's like, so the building is occupied pretty much 24/7. So I thought I'd end on a couple of quotes. And I've got more project to show, but I thought I'd end my kind of argument, or if it's an argument, discussion, with a couple more quotes that I feel kind of underline that. And that what really, in a kind of rambling sort of way, I've tried to show that through our own experience is how important having access to resources and space within the city is actually vital to any kind of real creative. And ultimately, because creativity comes from not the pressure of being able to, sorry, the lack of pressure that you're allowed to fail. So if you have to succeed and if the value is so high that you cannot take risks, then ultimately you cannot create things of any real value, any new value. You can only rehash things. And I think in a kind of context of this, which is kind of explicitly about cultural planning, that's the thing, the case I'd like to make is that it's, I'd like to kind of, if there's any kind of case I could make, it's like, it's really the thing to do is not go away and make things, it's making the conditions where things can be made and which things can happen. And in a kind of more self-initiated, more peaceful, more inclusive way, and ultimately in a more sustainable way. So I'm going to end with two quotes. There's one by a kind of constant inspiration to us, Lina Bobardi, who, if you don't know, you should really look up. She was an Italian female architect, one of the only kind of real female modernists working in Brazil, who designed this incredible set of kind of public buildings in an age where you didn't really, especially in Brazil, didn't really do that type of thing, that are still kind of in active, vibrant use today. And I think it was one of the people we didn't know about her when we started, and then the more we found out about it, the more we realised that she was completely like chimed with our way of thinking. But the artist's freedom has always been individual, but true freedom can only be collective. A freedom aware of social responsibilities, which can knock down the frontiers of aesthetics. And I think that's a really, really nice thing to end on, because it's the idea that it's not just about you doing what you want, it's about how you make that condition for others and how you share that condition, how like by collectively having that condition you can actually engage in something that's much more than the sum of its parts. And then a quote from David Harvey, the kind of Marxist theoretician, which is the freedom to make and remake our cities and ourselves is, I want to argue, one of the most precious yet most neglected of human rights. And I think those two together sort of sum up our attitude to kind of urban space and particularly cultural space. Is that I mean, there's like a huge number of other kind of other practitioners of the quotes I can if you look at people like Raymond Williams, who was writing kind of his essay "Culture is Ordinary," which kind of talks about how we often assume that cultures are the reverse of people in museums, and that actually it's something that exists everywhere. And there's a lot of this type of stuff. But this idea that actually what's the most valuable thing, or the hardest thing to create in the current conditions is the ability for people to have like autonomy and authority and agency. And what we've realised, kind of looking back on our work, is that ultimately that's what we've been trying to do with all of it. So that's where I'm going to end my kind of speech. And thought I'd have some question and answers, and if there's particular projects I could talk about, I've got some slides on the stuff in Baltic Street, which is the playground. I've got some slides on the stuff in Liverpool, and I'm kind of up for being told what you guys would like to hear about. Or if you've got any questions on that stuff, but yeah, I've kind of got a bunch more stuff that I can, I think mainly on Baltic Street and Liverpool, just because they're the ones I've worked on the most, so I'm kind of very comfortable with the material, and we don't all work together all the time, but yeah, so any questions?
Okay, well, I think you lifted us out of our depression, which is really good. We were a bit worried before dinner, and now we all know what to do. Just go out there and do it. So
well, I think that is the message, actually. Like it's not like it's often treated like you can't do things, and actually you can.
Yes. Okay. So comments? Yes, you got.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm working as an artist, and here.
Well, sorry.
So I'm curious, in the city where I live, the city owns some buildings, and the cultural department of the city has a policy, as you say, that there must be affordable spaces for the artists to produce and create things. But then there is another department of the city that is in charge of all the buildings. So now, last year, there happened this conflict that they are under pressure of having, you know, revenue and making a profit of the building that the city owns. So they decided, okay, we're going to double the rent here because that is far too cheap. This is not market rents. While the cultural department had just, you know, the year before, you know, written into their policy that the city should provide. So there's a conflict going on, but, you know, they're just raising the prices and now the artists are moving out. So I'm curious, in your process of all these different ones, have you been also in dialogue with the local authorities, the councils, or has it only been private property owners, or how to deal with that aspect of it?
So yes, we have been. Yes, it's also difficult, I think. Sometimes it hasn't really worked. So we're in a couple of really long-term conversations with different councils. We're currently talking to Southwark Council, we're currently talking to Haringey, and it is really difficult. So I don't really have a good answer. I think what we have, the way we've tried to do it is basically putting ourselves in position as developer, and wearing that hat, and to kind of greater or lesser extent success depending on the project. So Sugar House, we're the developer. With someone like Black Horse, we're just quite lucky, I think, in a sense that the council, because of the problems that just happened, the council and the kind of leadership in that council, they were very amiable to the suggestion of something like that. And now that it has been a big success, and it's like politically, PR-wise, it's like really great. You know, it's like it's kind of, again, one of these things that is now used in kind of pretty much every GLA publication has about workspace or creativity has Black Horse. So in that sense, we've been quite lucky to kind of build a good PR, and I think it is, I don't know, in experience, a lot of it is about trying to talk the language as much as possible, so trying to make the argument in economic terms, but also in kind of social welfare terms. So like, you know, this is, you know, so partly the argument with Black Horse that I didn't really talk about was, and it didn't really happen in that way in the end, but it was partly inspired by the kind of men shed movement, which was about trying to get elderly men who often have real problems with loneliness and isolation, you know, just partly, you know, for a variety of social, political, and economic reasons, to give them a space, give partly them a space to go to that allowed them to be kind of socially and active. So there was a kind of real kind of, I guess, social welfare argument that actually in the long term you're probably potentially saving money, because people who are active are less likely to kind of have kind of various mental and physical problems that then need kind of expensive treatment. So yeah, it's like trying to know when. And it's difficult, and it feels compromised, and often it feels like you're making quite big compromises, but it feels like trying to know when it's important to, which is why I kind of it's the first time I've shown kind of spreadsheets, and I think something that I've thought to do a lot more times is like actually knowing when you have to talk the kind of economics and make the case on those terms, because ultimately I think you will always become marginalised. And I think something where generally architecture, I know I kind of say this more because it's obviously the profession that I've kind of come through, that I'm like more in touch with the professional world, has been very bad at, where it's always treated itself as like beyond money. And I think that's problematic, because I think unless you understand the system and can explain the system and can reflect the system back, you have very little opportunity to change it and challenge it. And so it feels like the way of doing it is to like talk money better. Because actually a lot of this stuff is bullshit as well. Like the returns the councils often get fleeced. You know, like the reference I made to Aylesbury Estate, the council sold it for something like 22 million, and the developer is going to make several billion off it. It's like, you know, the economics in terms of the public purses don't stack up. So it feels like trying to have those arguments is the best way.
Yeah.
I'm interested in your skill set. So how you sort of showed us with the first project, sort of a lot of hands-on volunteer help. But I'm imagining that in order to progress and describe yourself as developers and what have you, there must be a sort of core group of people that are working together. So I'm sort of interested a bit in how who those people are, how you came together, and how that's stuck together, and how that's sustainable for you as a group of people who have, you know, the skills and ability to be able to sort of make these places actually happen, survive, and set up new ones as well.
So majority of us study architecture. We met while at Cambridge, and then really everyone who joined essentially joined through appearing and chipping in and just like mucking in. Chipping is the wrong word. Mucking in on that first project, and then the one that followed it, the kind of folly for a flyover. And it was really a case if you hung around and were interested in, and were convinced enough that this was a good thing to be working on, because there was no, at this point, that we weren't successful. There was no reason. You only did it because you wanted to do it. We weren't anything. We didn't have a name. Cinerolium, we had no name. We thought long that we didn't really want a name. We really the argument that the work kind of talked for itself. And then sort of since then, we just worked together for a very long time. And I guess I don't know why we've stuck together in that answer. I think that's a very hard one. I think ultimately it's because collectively each individual believes that they're better working as part of the collective than they are working individually, that other people make up for their kind of failings. And I know individually that I'm good at some things and some things I'm not so good at, and that there are people in the group who are much better at the things that I'm bad at, and equally there are people who are worse at things I'm good at, and that is a really nice dynamic. And I think it ultimately it relies on a kind of atmosphere of kind of collective and communal trust, and that's kind of it in terms of how we work as a group. And there's kind of rules between us and informal stuff, but ultimately it's underpinned by that they're really trying to do is help clarify. But ultimately, without that, it would very quickly fall apart. In terms of the skills, a lot of the time we didn't have them, which is the case of kind of slightly blagging it, and I guess a slightly naivety that I guess with the Cinerolium and things like that, we're just out of college, university. And that naivety actually in some ways being a good thing, that like no one's told you can't do something, so you might as well give it a go. And in some cases, probably an element of luck and determination. Also, you can kind of, but I think the ability to kind of throw yourself at something and learn from it, and it's something that you do get collective, you get collective strength. If there's, I think there's one thing. It's like if people often ask, like, how it works for so many people, and I always think it's simpler. If there's 3 people, if one person disagrees, that's quite close. If there's 15 people, either it's close and no one's really wrong, everyone's sort of, it's not, difference of opinions kind of like, you're not wrong, but you're just on the losing side a bit. But it's like everyone, you're just definitely wrong. If there's 15 people telling you you're wrong, it's like, okay, fine, I've misjudged this one. And like, actually, in some ways, decisions are almost easier to make in that sense because it becomes less personal, because you're more dispersed. In that sense, being more has actually been of value. But yeah, it's a tricky one. We're really ultimately it's like by learning the skills when we need them. Yeah.
I suppose what was behind my question is about, I've been also involved over my lifetime in projects that have been, they relied a lot on that kind of approach. And then, things change. People go off and have kids, or they get a job, or they get offered something. And that, I suppose what I'm interested a little bit in is there do you see it as a sort of long-term, I'm guessing you'll say it's flexible, and is there a sort of core of people that drive it forward, or do you think it's a bigger group that does that, and therefore can it roll forward irrespective of who leaves or goes off and does something else?
So I don't know to some extent, but currently all 16 people are like entirely equal, and there's not, and everyone is working either 4 days a week or 5 days a week essentially for Assemble, and that includes like people who teach. That's kind of included in that and the people doing 4 days are doing for generally like one's had a kid, so he's doing 4 days because he's looking after his kid, which is like a great thing, and I'm trying to build a house for myself, so I'm taking it. So like it's like that sort of thing. It's like people aren't working elsewhere. It's like so in that sense, and we're a business. We make some money. We make much less money than we would if we went to like more corporate-minded practices. But in terms of in some ways in that sense, it's a lifestyle choice where I'm happy doing what I do. I get like flown places. I get to come here, which is essentially which is great. And I get to feel that I believe in the things I'm doing. I think it's really important to like kind of understate. We don't think we've come up with anything new. Like we're not like we don't believe that we've like come up with this amazing like thing that no one's ever thought of. There's loads of people before us who've done similar things. We've done it better, done it differently. The only thing we'd say that we've done that's really great, we've done something that really works for us. We look back at people like William Morris. And there's loads of people in the background who we're incredibly indebted to in our kind of formation. But yeah. I think in that sense, we don't know. It might all fall apart if we all start needing lots more money suddenly. But at the moment, I guess the ambition is to try and make it economically sustainable. We're trying to make a situation where we can all earn enough from it to exist.
Great.
If you look at the sort of the external relations, I mean, not just much how it's working within, but sort of how you relate to the community and how the community relates to you. The project in Black Horse is very much like community-based, or it's connected somehow. Do you get a sense that it is not just the guys who are aging and need a place to be, but how has it changed? Can you see that it actually has changed the neighbourhood, the community? Can you get any sense of that? Are you conscious about that, or do you invest in it, or is it just something which happens on itself, or happens on its own, or do you use actually time and money and to invest in that to actually strengthen it, or position it, or use it, or whatever, or is that just something which happens and grows and is automatic, you might say?
I guess it's sort of all of those things, which I know is not a very, it's kind of feels like I'm dodging the answer, the question, but I guess what I mean by that, so we're still on the board, for example, we're still on the board of Black Horse, so 2 of us sit on the board, so we're still deeply invested in that, but it also exists as a separate company. And that was, and different projects we've done different things with, depending on what feels appropriate for the project. So Black Horse is one where it felt like it actually was much better and had a really good team there who could take it and run it and do their own thing with it, and ultimately that was fine, and it was actually really good to kind of let it go, and we didn't have to be kind of part of it. We could take a step back and not be running it. But like I said, we still obviously maintain relationships. We just did their extension. 2 of us are still on the board, so in that sense, it's something we're still deeply committed to. But it felt like it actually just it kind of worked in such a way that meant that we didn't have to be involved. Something like Baltic Street, we're basically still running it. So that's one where, and I think it's also partly due to the nature of the community. So Baltic Street is in one of the poorest areas in the EU, one of the poorest areas it's in the UK, in east end of Glasgow and Dalmarnock, where the life expectancy drops by 10 years when you go into it, and for no one really can completely explain why. And so that's one where it's obviously in some ways socioeconomically, like Black Horse was already a space of people really making things, and actually you're tapping into a kind of stream that already existed, made it easier. Whereas there was really kind of trying to create something new, and so that's required a huge amount more kind of investment. And I think there's Marcus Mason writes a lot, interestingly, about how you, like when you let things fail and when things you push things, and like this kind of relationship of being somewhere, and how like this idea of, I think Franco Banchini talked about it in the last one about like facilitating autonomous production, all those relationships, and like when you release things and when you kind of push them and when you like let them fail. And I think they're really interesting, really difficult conversations, and it feels like it's very much based on the project and the situation you're in, when one is appropriate and when one isn't, and when you should keep going, when you should back off, and when you can let it go, and when you should just ultimately let it kind of stop, and it isn't the thing there.
So when you, I mean, because some of the discussion has been in other of the workshops has been about should then artists become entrepreneurial and actually, you might say, take control of their own environment and create space and create production facilities and so on, and actually develop economies to do that, or should they still be dependent on either foundations or private sector or the public sector to actually, before they're allowed to? So this actually taking this active role. Is it a tendency, a trend, or are you the exception? I mean, is it something which you can see that artists are having to do more and more because they've been put in that position because of, you might say, the way the cities are being run or not run, the market situation with buildings, with property and so on. So are they becoming in that desperate situation where they're having to actually take on roles which are not traditionally theirs?
So yeah, I mean, I don't feel qualified to talk about art as a whole. I think it's also, I think it's not a matter of should or should not. It's a matter of they have to. I mean, again, the situation in the UK is the one I'm most familiar with. But here we're in a situation where the Arts Council funding has been cut by, I think it's about 40%. Who are the main kind of grant-giving body. We don't have a kind of philanthropic culture like the Americas does, and so you have to. I think the problem I have with the entrepreneurialism and entrepreneurial turn, as often referred to, is that it's not enough. I think a lot of people justify their activity by saying, oh, it's entrepreneurial, it's embedded, it's cultural, it's participatory. And I think that you have to really engage with what you're trying to do. And then you can decide if being entrepreneurial is appropriate or not. And I think it's too often used as like, it's a good thing in itself. Just being engaged is good. And actually you should just question what the engagement is doing before. And I think there's a lot of stuff, you get these kind of, and like a lot of stuff's really, really great out there, but a lot of stuff is you get these horrible like shanty chic kind of wooden shacks that appear everywhere that are sort of like, you know, somehow community led, and like you've like done this engagement activity where you've asked the people if they want it blue or red, and somehow that's like activating their kind of deep in, you know, and it's just bullshit. Where like I think who is it? It's there's a theorist who talks about the difference between participation and collaboration. And that participation is the people who participate do it on your terms. Where you give them a set of rules, i.e. is the thing blue or red, and they can only obey with those rules. Well, collaboration actually vests power in the people you're working with. And I think that's for me, that feels like a really crucial distinction. Between like collaboration is the thing you want to aim for. If you want to have that sort of impact, you should, like, not that, again, like, I'm not saying participation is bad, but I think participation that is pretending that it's doing something else is bad. Like, again, all these things, I'm not criticizing any of these activities, but I think a lot of the time you have things that masquerade as one thing that are doing something very different, and that's where I get really deeply uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, I mean, we had a discussion, we've a non-stop discussion about how to engage people or participate, but I think your terminology, the way you describe it, is actually quite interesting, because it's more, of course, more equal, more kind of situation. Okay. Anyone else? Come on, yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Lina. I used to live in London, and I completely identify with the idea of trying to find artist workspace. And the last place where I had rented was called Second Floor Studios, and they're in Woolwich. And basically, they've got a lease. It used to be an old Windows frame factory, and it's functioning, and they have a lot of studios there. Most of the artists there, we all basically used to come in the evenings. We luckily had 24-hour access. But there's always this threat of the Thames is developing. There's more development happening along, and now they've got Crossrail happening as well. And so what's going to happen to this, you know, a home for artists in London? I do question that, because we're constantly being driven further and further out. And I'm wondering, is there some kind of network for people who, like you and others that I know from Second Floor Studios, that can exchange ideas, or who have, because all of you get quite involved with the law, and perhaps you can help each other out and give each other tips and stuff like that. So I'm wondering, is there some kind of network like that exists?
Actually, I think one of the things we're self-critical about is that we've actually been quite like insular about how we've worked for probably a bit too long, and I actually think that I don't know is the honest answer. I think I haven't encountered it, but we are in partly we've been insular just in terms of because we had to move and there was, you know, various things, but we're trying to become much more outward looking, and trying to kind of engage much more, and I guess also partly got ourselves to a kind of level that we can start doing that. I mean, I don't know. London worries me. I grew up in London. I've lived in London my whole life. And the kind of quotes from Mark Fisher, who is like deeply pessimistic, like chime me a lot. And I am also very worried. I don't really know. I guess my feeling is that doesn't mean it's not worth trying to do other things. And I think, I don't know. I mean, like, this is one of the things, if you ask different members of the Assembly, they'd give you different answers. But personally, I think the only way of doing it is by starting to take stock out of the kind of market system. So, like, people like Acme are really good at doing that. I don't know if you know them. They're like another studio providers, or like, you know, they're very good at like intentionally taking things out of, or like CLTs as a vehicle. And there's various other things, and they're all very small at the moment. But it feels like that currently feels like the sustainable way of doing it. And so we're working on a very early stage project which is trying to take buildings, into kind of trusts, independent trusts that are explicitly and permanently kind of non-profit, as a way of kind of trying to avoid that. But yeah, I mean the long-term trends are pretty fucking bleak, aren't they? Like, let's be honest.
But that's why I'm wondering if you could bind together with these kinds of people, because there's the duo that runs Second Floor Studios. They're very much about community-driven things. And the same thing when, at some point, I also rented desk space around Soho. And these people, the couple that run Sohost, they are behind the fair trade movement and the Berwick Street Market. And, you know, I'm noticing that there's people working independently in London and they have similar ethical values, but they don't know of each other's existence. And I'm wondering that things are getting bleaker and bleaker, but I just feel like it's time to just connect and maybe, you know, get to know each other before, pardon my French, but shit really hits the fan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be really great. And I think it's something we've recently tried to, we've recently just started I guess we've relied a lot on like just meeting people recently, but we've started much more being directly emailing people we think are great and just being like, we think you're really good. Is there something you need help with, in a sense? But yeah, I completely agree. Okay,
bleak future, but anyway, ways of surviving in the cracks and nooks. Okay, do you want to make a last? Do you think it'd be fitting to do a last presentation, not knowing quite what it is? Would you like to do that? Is it the one in Glasgow?
Well, I've got two. It depends if you're interested. I mean, it is also late. I mean, I'm sure it's a beer. I'd like another.
We could. Somebody go out and get the beers.
I'd like another beer, personally.
Okay, get the beer. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I've got two projects I could talk about that I really kind of enjoy. One is the Liverpool, which is a bit of a mission because it's quite a long one. Because it feels like without really talking about the kind of situation existing, it'd be very hard. The other one is Glasgow, which is the adventure playground that the video that's kind of scrolling in the background is.
Let's do that one.
I'll do what I'm told.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just
right,
I'm going to
have to just jump through a bunch of slides really quickly till I get there. So ignore. Look away now. So, Baltic Street, right. There's a bit of a sea change from quite serious conversations, so I need to try and restart. So, Baltic Street Adventure Playground is kind of an ongoing project, and so I guess partly in kind of Trevor's question, this is a project that we have ended up maintaining a far closer relationship for a lot longer, and this is really one that. I guess it's about belief in education. So, I mean, those ideas I kind of talked about access, we feel are kind of obviously work through all generations, and education in kids feels like a really amazing one. And I think if you look at something that distinguishes essentially private education in the UK, is that it really gives people an ability to feel like they're playing and they're doing things, and state education really has had that cut out of it by kind of total lack of funding. And I actually don't know what slides I've got for this one, so this might be a slightly... and so we were invited to take part in a competition which was the main arts competition of the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow in 2014. And we were basically invited after they ran one competition. No, we were invited because one of the people we work with on the Folly were kind of asked to kind of put forward people for it. And we felt that, I guess, in the context of where the games were, where most of the play provision looked like this, that kind of anything that was a more normal kind of art piece would be deeply inappropriate. So if you built a sculpture on a roundabout, or I don't know, it was very hard to think of what a conventional kind of art commission really was trying to do. And so we thought that the thing to propose was something that was actually fundamentally useful. That kind of took the money. It was about £300,000, and really did something in a kind of real bit of infrastructure. And the area was having a huge amount of development because of the Commonwealth Games. But we felt that in the lifespan of a child, we're talking 5, 6, 7 years. That's kind of huge. If you're 5 and you've got to wait 5 years before your playground's ready, that's your entire childhood. Where if you're 25 and you've got to wait 5 years for a house to be ready, that feels like somehow less problematic. And also, as a result of the kind of investment for the Commonwealth Games, there was a lot of landscaping. And we worked out after a while that landscaping basically meant the council was an excuse for the council to demolish something. So they landscape something into disappearing entirely. And then at the same time, we were doing a lot of reading on adventure playground movement in England, which was a movement that emerged initially in the interwar period, then really took hold after the Second World War. Basically because you had a lot of bomb sites that killed kids who were already playing on. And the idea that actually play in that sort of risky play was something that was deeply valuable. And, oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
That's incredibly kind.
Do continue.
Thank you. And that felt that we felt chimed with. I guess I mean I felt like I was very lucky that I went to grew up in such a way that I was kind of encouraged to build and explore and muck about and cut myself and set fire to things, and generally those type of kind of exploratory things actually really help you define who you are as a human. And there's a quote I like to read that I think says it much better than I probably can, which is when children play, they tend to play in a slightly chaotic way. Children play best when they're on the edge of chaos. On one side of this edge is the state of ordered play, where the child may be directed or organised in the way they play. On the other side of the edge of chaos is complete chaos, where children find it difficult to play, possibly as a result of bullying, lack of boundaries, confusion, or real fear for their own safety. Which is a quote by a writer called Arthur Batram, working with Wendy Russell. And that felt really important. It's like, it's the space that isn't about kind of an understanding of how adults deem things, but equally is contained enough to not feel like downright dangerous. And that's a space of kind of self-exploratory, self-learning that is incredibly valuable and doesn't really exist in most mainstream education models. And then we found this site, which was anecdotally a former playground. And it had been owned by the council, and it kind of was stuck in this kind of slightly strange limbo, and had been kind of quite politically contentious, so the council were quite happy to give it to us. So the answer to that question is like, it was good PR for them to give it to us. Because we had some money and they had no money. And then it was really about looking at, as quickly as possible, trying to get the site in use. So we had, over the kind of October half-term holiday, we dumped loads of bark chip on the site, dumped a load of mud. We met an incredibly extraordinary play worker called Robert Kennedy, who grew up in the area and kind of deeply indebted to for the entire project, really, who came on as a play worker, but much more beyond that. And then really looked at like what were the obstacles for children playing in the space. And one of the most important ones was just access to equipment, where a lot of the kids, again, were very poor. The situation where they went out playing and their parents would shout at them when they got home because they got muddy. And so the first thing the thing bought, instead of investing in kind of signage or something flashy or some design, was raincoats and boots. So the kids came on, they could change their clothes into raincoats and boots. We had a kind of container that was kind of set aside from that. We all got, so in England to work with children, you have like a criminal record check. So all the team who worked on it had like the full criminal record check. So we could all work directly with the kids, which was really lovely, really amazing, kind of one of the nicest projects I've ever worked on. And the other one was food, which is, it's an area that, it's a food desert. I don't know if that's a term that translates, but the idea that there's areas where you can't buy fresh fruit and vegetables in a kind of walking area. So this is an area that's kind of really chronic that, and there's quite high level of nutrition. The play worker, Robert, his breakfast, he grew up in this area, his breakfast is a can of Coke and a Milky Bar. Which is, again, that probably wasn't to translate. Milky Bar is like a white chocolate, the sugariest, like nastiest chocolate, and he is aware that that is kind of perverse, but it's because he's so inbuilt. That's the thing he has to do. So it's this odd thing where he's telling the children about good nutrition while like exhibiting extremely poor nutrition. But and then trying to provide this kind of state of exception, where children were free to play, that existed within the kind of health and safety kind of framework, that we provided a kind of essentially a legal state of exception, because we had staff, because we had kind of monitoring that enabled us to kind of allow this kind of blurry chaos. And where kind of kids were just like, you know, key elements of mud, water, scrap, tools, campfire, and this stuff that really is not about what I guess we normally think of as design. You know, it looks chaotic, it looks scrappy, but that's the kind of point, is that it's not about a kind of adult reading of what is aesthetically pleasing. It's about a kind of opportunity of freedom. And then crucially, that every day that all the kids involved would come together. So that's Robert in the red jacket. All the play workers had red jackets, just kind of trying to make it easier to identify who they were. Would bring all the kids together around the campfire and have a discussion about what happened, what worked well, what hadn't worked well, what they want, what their hopes were. And ultimately, essentially, it's like giving control to the kids. So there were two, which I was supposed to say this at a slide a while back, but I'll say it now. There was only one rule to the playground, which is you can play however you want, but you cannot play in a way that prevents someone else from playing how they want. And you can basically cascade any kind of social rules down from that one. And the other rule for play workers was you were not allowed to get involved with the children playing unless there was something actually dangerous happening or they invited you. And a lot of the time they do invite you, but the point is that you engaged on their terms. You didn't come and be like, oh no, you're doing that wrong, and take over. You were like, the kid was like, oh, how do I do this? And be like, okay. And that was the thing, is like it was entirely on their terms you engaged with them. And create this kind of amazing malleable landscape where kids who had been excluded from school, who were seen as troubled, who were seen as dangerous, we have had no real problems. You know, we have arguments and, you know, all the normal things that happen, but like no fundamental problems. We've had no accidents. We had our first breakage after like 3 years of working on this, like a year ago, where someone tripped over and broke their arm. But I think I think Wendy Russell is better than a broken bone and a broken spirit. So it's the captain attitude. But ultimately, the idea is that the kids fundamentally have like ability to remake, to self-organize the same. Yeah, sorry, same video again. To self-organize and to kind of establish this terrain that is theirs, that they're allowed to explore and ultimately explore their agency in the city. And there's a piece of research that I've completely forgotten what the kind of provenance is, that was commissioned by the Department of Education, that established that the biggest identifiers to kind of later success in life for children learning is grist, which is the idea of like the ability to keep working at something, and agency, the idea that you have power over yourself. And the kids that have that kind of embedded in them during kind of their kind of formative years are the ones who are much more like successful in the broader sense. So like self-reported successful. This isn't about like financial success. This is about like kind of a feeling of kind of happy, functioning kind of citizens in that sense. And so really, this is about kind of trying to breed that. And yeah, and that's kind of it, and it's still running. So like I said, I think I said it earlier, we're currently trying to fundraise for a permanent building. It's kind of been operating out of sheds and things like that at the moment. It's got kind of now has permanent revenue funding for the next 4 years, which is a kind of a big thing. And I think there are like things that trouble me about it. I think it's like it's not ideal that arts funding is paying for social services. I think that's fundamentally problematic. But it feels like it's a case of realpolitik, which I think is that argument about entrepreneurialism in art. Like it felt like in this context there was going to be no investment from the state. So I would rather this than personally it felt like a thing to invest in. But I do think it's not a great situation when things that probably are fundamental civic functions and that we should be providing through taxation and through kind of government spending are being provided through arts grants. But I mean, there's like all these things, they're always kind of compromised. But I think ultimately it has proven to be an amazing place that working the kids have really has something that doesn't exist in that area, and that is an area where like it has a deep-seated suspicion of external involvement because generally when it happens, people have lost stuff. And these are people who have nothing. Like this is an incredibly poor area, and so it's been a really like rewarding experience working there, and it feels like it's had a real kind of impact.
Okay, that seems to be about it then, isn't it? It's a great story to end on. Fine, I think that's perfect. So let's say thank you very much. And we'll meet again upstairs, everybody in the bar, I guess. Okay, so thank you for coming.
Thank you. My quote about participation versus collaboration is David Beach is the person who said it. Yeah, in the interest